Okay, well, thanks everyone to the organizers, especially for inviting me to give this talk, and thanks especially to Jacob, who basically did a great job introducing a lot of the basic concepts about understanding how dust disks emit light or reflect light. So you can think of debris disks as like a large collection of very, very tiny planets that reflect light and also emit light thermally. So that's kind of the two ways we're going to be detecting debris disks and understanding what they're made of. Um, so there is dust all throughout our galaxy and universe. We're talking about like micron-sized particles, and there's circumstellar dust in a lot of different contexts as well. And when you're looking at dust in a system, you can think of dust, in addition to being tiny planets, you can think of them as well as being sort of like sailboats on a current, right? So I live in Maryland. We're near the Chesapeake Bay. My kids sail. These are little sailboats. You can think of dust grains as little sailboats as well, because they're under the influence of many different forces. So just like sailboats blow in the wind and move in the direction of a wind, and they are carried by currents, so too are dust grains pushed along by winds or pressure or gravity. And all those forces, combined with their composition and emission properties, are the things that we use to sort of understand debris disks and how they fit in to planetary systems. So I'm going to talk about debris disks in the context of debris disks are really collections of dust that trace sort of the minor body population of a planetary system, and they form through collisions of small bodies or somehow the destruction of these small bodies. And that tracer is a really useful complement to studying planets in direct imaging. So for example, I'll give us our closest debris disk that is in our own solar system. So many of you may have heard of the zodiacal cloud. So that is sort of the cloud of dust that is associated with our own asteroid belt. And that's sort of, here we go, there we go, represented here by this little bright smudge close to Earth, Venus, and Mars. So I should say this is a picture, sort of a model of our own solar system if we were looking outside of our solar system at invisible light, so about 0.5 microns of wavelength. So thanks, Aki, for this very nice picture. And so while the planets all reflect light as well, so too does the dust. And because there's and interestingly, right, the amount of dust in the asteroid belt in total is something like a tenth of an Earth mass, maybe a hundredth of an Earth mass, and the actual mass that we're seeing in this scattered light is many orders of magnitude smaller than that. So our little planets that are reflecting light are really, really efficient at doing it because they're spread out over a large area compared to the surface area of a planet. And then if we step out to the giant planet forming region, or where all the giant planets live, we have more dust associated with the Kuiper belt, which are the icy bodies associated with sort of the giant planet formation region in our own solar system. And you can see that in some places there are structures that are being created by dynamical resonances with the giant planets. So in this case, Neptune is sort of carving out a piece of the disk, and you see some gaps present. So not only does dust imply that there are presence of planets, it can actually show us where the planets might be residing. So if we step a little further out, we go to some nearby main sequence stars. They also have dust disks around them. And they have been detected through various means, which I'll talk about later. And so here I'm just giving an example of one of our closest examples. This is Epsilon Eridani. It has a known planet at about 3 AU. It has an inner warm dust belt that has been detected through infrared excess radiation. And then there's also a larger belt that has been detected with the submillimeter and sort of hundreds of microns wavelength through like Herschel and Spitzer. So we can see, and Epsilon Eridani is only like a few parsecs away. So it's sort of one of our closest examples of a mature planetary system that's a little bit younger than us, but has a very similar structure to its dust disks, which sort of implies that perhaps it has a similar planetary architecture. But of course, we can't see all the planets that are present in the system. We're just not sensitive to them, but we are sensitive to the dust. And so that can help us sort of get a sense of what maybe a typical planetary architecture might be. And then main sequence stars aren't the only objects in our galaxy that have dust. Massive stars have dust in orbit around them, probably not due to planetary systems, but there are evidence of debris disks in particular around giant stars and around white dwarfs. So white dwarfs usually show their dust through infrared excesses at mid-infrared wavelengths. It's usually pretty warm. We think this is due to planetesimals getting kicked into the inner system of the white dwarf and getting broken apart. And we see, even with JWST, some hints of perhaps dust emission at even like 20 microns. And then it gets tricky because is this one emission point that seems to be in excess around this one white dwarf due to a planet that is very cold and a few giga-years old, or is it due to dust? And so that's a whole talk in of itself, which I don't have time to give. But we think there are even planetary systems around white dwarfs after post-main sequence evolution has evolved. And JWST right now is sensitive to those planets. So hopefully we'll hear more about that in coming years. So you can even directly image planets around a white dwarf if you so choose. And then we've seen dust not just in infrared emission, but also in scattered visible light. And so this is a collection of debris disks observed by Hubble, primarily with the STScI coronagraph. And these are sort of the biggest, brightest ones that we know of. And they're all comprised of pretty cold dust. These are sort of the outer edges of planetary systems that we're seeing. So very much like our own Kuiper belt, but kind of on steroids. These systems tend to be much younger, and they tend to have a lot more dust than our own solar system. But you can see that they have a wide diversity of shapes and sizes. Some of them are just because of the random inclinations that we observe planetary systems, right? So we see some edge-on planetary systems here, for example, and then these are more face-on disks at sort of low inclinations. But then we have things that look very fluffy, and in this case, you're looking at an edge-on disk, but there's a lot of dust material that's being blown out of the midplane of the disk. And so we want to understand why disks look like that, and what is a typical disk structure, because that helps us to interpret what we're actually seeing. And generally, we think that debris disks are sort of the remnants of planetary formation, right? So when a star forms, it forms in a cloud of material, and it forms, and eventually that material settles into a disk of gas and dust, and that's a protoplanetary disk, something that I don't think we'll talk too much of in this session, but eventually that gas and dust starts forming planets and minor bodies, and those planets start to carve out gaps, and the inner system starts to blow away its gas and dust just as the star achieves its sort of total luminosity. And over time, that disk loses mass because most of the material is accreting onto the star or onto planets. So this is a picture of PDS 70 rotated a little bit. And then eventually all the gas pretty much goes away, and all the dust, the primordial dust, gets locked up into planets or minor bodies, and you're sort of left with this planetary system. But those minor bodies start interacting with each other. They start colliding. In the inner system, comets come in and release a lot of dust and gas as they evaporate. And that residual second generation dust is what we think is the source for a typical debris disk. So debris disks are really sort of a signpost of a mature planetary system that has done its formation and is now just sort of dynamically evolving over time until the star eventually runs out of fuel and you get a post-main sequence white dwarf planetary system. And we think that to 0th order, you can explain the morphology of all the disks that I showed by sort of two bounding cases. So if you have your parent bodies, so these are your kilometer, 10-kilometer series-sized asteroids or comets, they live at some radius, right? And they're kind of chugging along, gravitationally interacting, and occasionally they collide and create a whole puff of dust of various sizes, all the way from the size of the objects that are colliding, all the way down to micron-sized dust. And depending on the luminosity of the star, certain forces come into play. So when things are colliding a lot, right, when you have a lot of parent bodies and there are a lot of collisions dominate the dynamics of the dust and how the dust disk evolves. That's called a collisional disk. right? So optical depth is just essentially how many grains are participating or how many bodies are participating over a given surface area. Okay, and so in this case, collisions dominate, and so the size distribution of your dust, all the way from the big things down to the little things, are roughly determined by a power law, and are weighted to the point where you have a lot of small dust and very little big stuff, right? And then eventually you get so small that the small dust grains start to feel the pressure from the central star, called radiation pressure. That's just the photons hitting the dust grain. And if you're small enough, you just get blown out of the system. And so you get a halo of material that's pushed out. You can also get halos from interactions with the interstellar medium. If the interstellar medium is dense enough and coming at you at the right direction, you can push grains out of the dust, out of the disk system by that ram pressure, essentially. And then if you're a slightly larger dust grain, you don't feel radiation pressure. You stick around, but you can feel what's called Poynting-Robertson drag, which is basically there's a momentum transfer and asymmetry between the photon that hits a dust grain and how it's re-emitted thermally. And that differential drags smaller dust in or slightly larger dust in. And you can also have a solar wind that basically does the same thing, depending on the type of wind you might have. And so usually in a collisional disk, you don't see that stuff that's dragged in because everything collides down and then blows out before anything can move very much. But eventually, if you have a lower number of bodies, you're in a situation where collisions are no longer dominant and small dust starts getting dragged in, and that's called a transport-dominated disk. So primarily what we have observed to date have been collisional disks, the brightest of the disks, the most massive of the disks, the weirdest of the disks. But as we get more and more sensitive to different types of debris disks, we're going to start seeing more and more examples of the transport-dominated disks. And for example, in our own solar system, which is orders of magnitude less massive than a lot of the cold debris disks we've been observing, that's a transport-dominated disk, right? And so the morphology of a transport-dominated disk is a little bit different. Usually you see like rings associated with a collisional disk, whereas you'll see annuli, a big fluffy disk in a transport-dominated disk. So this is, I'm sorry I didn't credit Meredith Hughes, but this is from Meredith Hughes' wonderful annual reviews article on debris disks. I highly recommend that you read this review if you want to get even more details than what I'm able to give today. But this gives a rough schematic of just everything that I was talking about, from like warm dust all the way down almost to the surface of the sun, can be detected all the way out to far distances with cold dust. And one way we can detect these is through infrared emission from the dust. So I mentioned infrared excesses. This is when you see, the light coming from a star, and you see more light than you would expect just from the star itself, the stellar photosphere. And what I'm showing here is a spectral energy distribution. So this is flux as a function of wavelength. And at short wavelengths, the photosphere, the star dominates. You can't see pretty much anything else, right? And then as you get to longer and longer wavelengths, you start to see emission from the dust in the system. And it can be decomposed into lots of different components. The warm exozote dust hangs out at a few hundred degrees temperature. It can, because it may be warm and also comprised of small grains, you might see a silicate emission feature at 10 microns. And then the colder dust doesn't have very strong emission features, but it really dominates because this typically has a much larger surface area. And you can even have other contributions from sort of like a halo of small grains, for example. And so any wavelength beyond 10 microns is fair game for studying debris disks in infrared emission and learning about their thermal emission properties. And if you go all the way out to the submillimeter, this slope of the thermal emission tells you something about the size distribution of the dust. And that's why people are really excited to use things like ALMA, where they can spatially resolve submillimeter emission. And why is that important? That's important because an unresolved spectral energy distribution, while incredibly useful, doesn't tell the whole story. So in this case, I have two different disks that look very different in morphology and even have different sort of characteristic radii to their disks. They have very similar temperatures as inferred by their spectral energy distributions, and the shape and relative brightness all look pretty much the same, but they turn into much different disks when you spatially resolve them. So having the thermal emission properties is extremely useful, but it's not the whole story. And spatially resolving the dust, understanding what temperature the dust is emitting at and where it's located is really important for understanding composition and sort of typical grain sizes for the dust. And that's why people love ALMA, because you can spatially resolve the thermal emission in really exquisite detail. And in some cases, I mentioned that primarily debris disks don't have a lot of gas, but in some cases they do. In particular, they sometimes have CO gas. And ALMA is really great because you can look at the continuum emission from the dust thermal emission, but you can also map out the gas emission in a disk and learn something about the kinematics of both the gas and presumably the dust. So this is a really interesting paper of a HD 110058, which is a fairly compact debris disk that has, interesting, a fair amount of gas. But there are other ways to observe disks, and sort of each technique has its pros and cons, of course. So what I'm showing here are two examples of interferometry. So luckily we have some more talks about interferometry that sort of explain the details of this. So I'm not going to go into so much detail here, but suffice it to say, interferometry gives you access to the hottest and warm sort of compact dust around nearby stars. And this is helpful for understanding maybe the presence of exozodies or the presence of really hot dust. So the top example is a figure from Steve Ertel's paper describing the hosts survey, which took the LBTI and used nulling interferometry to try to detect the emission from exozodi disks. And basically, if you have your disk, you run it through a transmission function of your interferometer, and then you can see at a given position angle on the sky some emission. And then if you look at a lot of different angles on the sky, you sort of fill out the coverage of the interferometry and you null out the star itself, and you're left with some excess emission. And then you total up all that emission and you estimate how many zodies of dust are present due to thermal emission. Conversely, you can just do straight long baseline interferometry and look to see whether the visibility as a function of baseline for your interferometer matches an unresolved source or whether it seems to be resolved with some structure. And then you fit various models to estimate this excess emission and whether it looks disk-like or not. And so in this case, these are observations of Kappa Tucana at two different wavelengths that seems to show a hot excess of dust that it's located a few tenths of an AU from the star. And I'll talk more about hot dust later because it's kind of an interesting story for things like the Habitable Worlds Observer. So interferometry is very popular, both at submillimeter wavelengths and also at shorter wavelengths to try to look at different types of debris disks. So I showed this picture before. This is, again, scattered visible light, high contrast imaging. You can also do this in the near infrared from the ground with extreme adaptive optics. And you can find all manner of debris disks. And in general, for any high contrast imaging system you have, whether you're sensitive to planets, you're usually sensitive to 10 times more disks. So whatever planet imager you create, you're going to be really good at finding disks as well. So I would say invest some time in learning about disks because they're fun and they're not just sort of things to remove. I know. It's trash to a lot of you. You just don't want those photons, but some of us do. In addition to total intensity light, which is primarily what people have been talking about, dust is very good at polarizing light, right? So because dust is forward scattering and is small, you actually get effects where you can polarize the incoming light from the star, and that is very powerful if you can detect it. This is an interesting case. This is HD 61005. You've seen a picture of it before from the example of the STS images, but this is intensity in polarized light. And these little white lines, which unfortunately are not super visible, it illustrates sort of how much the fractional polarization is as a function of distance from the central star. And that's essentially probing how effective does the dust scatter light in polarized intensity relative to how much it's scattering light in total intensity light. And that fraction as a function of scattering angle, so similar to when Jacob was talking about phase angles, right? In the scattering angle and how the light is distributed tells you something about the grain shapes, about the grain sizes, and how porous or not porous the dust is. And so these are some examples of in the literature of people trying to hash this out. So this is from GPI observations of HR 4796A, where they were able to measure total intensity as a function of scattering angle, as well as polarization fraction as a function of scattering angle in the near infrared. And what they found was that this is very hard to explain with most grain models. And typically when people try to model dust disks, they try to use Mie scattering as sort of a baseline theory, which assumes spherical grains. But there are all kinds of modifications to that where you maybe have different grain shapes, for example, that give you different properties, or you have different porosities of grains and different compositions. And the different composition and porosity give you different polarization fractions as a function of scattering angle. And so this is an example of something you might be able to do in the visible if you had that capability. And I should say Hubble had that capability for a few years on the ACS instrument, but that is no longer working. And so we don't really have the ability to do visible polarization at the present moment. But there is on the ground the possibility of doing a limited number of disks, this kind of experiment with a limited number of disks. It's very hard to do from the ground, however, because it's hard to get an absolute flux in total intensity. That's really challenging to do. So it's hard to get very accurate polarization fractions from the ground. Now, many people are working to improve this. So my hope is that in a few years, this will be more possible. Okay, I'm going to take a slight tangent because I used to work on the STS coronagraph for many years at Space Telescope Science Institute, so it has a very special place in my heart. And I figured that we'd be mostly in a lot of the other talks talking about the technical details of ground-based coronography. But I'm going to take a little bit of time to tell you that it's hard to do high contrast imaging, and there are a lot of things to think of. And so if you're just entering into a new instrument and doing high contrast imaging that you haven't done before, please, please, please read the existing documentation on that instrument to know all the little foibles and details that you have to figure out. And I'll just give you an example here. So I have a paper that I put out in JADIS in 2019 about all the little foibles and details of STS coronographic imaging. And there are some examples, unfortunately, in the literature where people have seen things they thought were debris disks in STS data, but probably aren't. So you have to be a little bit careful. And one thing you have to be careful of is that if you're doing observations, so these are raw images of HR 8799 that were taken with STS. So this is the occulter of STS. It's just a bar. It's not a fancy coronagraph. This is the least optimized coronagraph in space. And then what's happened, right, is we do a reference differential image with a PSF reference. And in this image, the reference is the same brightness as the target star. And you can see all these residual speckles. Because this isn't a good coronagraph, you see the diffraction spikes from the star. But it's not too bad. It's at a pretty low level. This is sort of like less than 10 to the -8 relative to the star. But then if you have a PSF reference that is putting more counts on the detector, because this is a CCD, charge transfer inefficiency starts coming into play. And especially for STS, which has been in orbit in space for 20 years and has had a lot of radiation damage, charge transfer inefficiency basically means that light gets trapped in different places on the detector and gets released later. So you are left with a glow that is dependent on how much background you have and how bright your source is. And so if you have a PSF that's not roughly putting the same amount of counts on the detector, you get these residual glow effects because the brighter star has more of its light concentrated in the PSF, and the fainter star here is like trailing right? So you get this sort of glow that you might think is a debris disk, but is actually just a detector effect. And the other thing I wanted to point out, which people should keep in mind, is that we have some ways to sort of predict what the speckle behavior on Hubble is. And in space, the two main contributors to speckles are spacecraft jitter and focus evolution. So low order aberrations and jitter are the two main speckle generators for a space telescope like Hubble. And so we can actually model that a little bit and compare that to data to sort of see how the speckles behave. So I want people to keep that in mind when they're doing their own investigations for future space telescopes, that we do have Hubble and a lot of archival data, and that can tell you some things about sort of speckle behavior in space if you're interested in following it up. That's a long segue to just say that technical details really matter sometimes. And to just continue this theme, this is also true for observatories like JWST. You have amazing stability in space, but then with JWST, because you have your mirrors, that can change how you view an extended source like a debris disk. So this is from Sasha Hinckley's ERS paper, where they're modeling a particular debris disk that they're going to observe with JWST. And so this is the noiseless perfect model. And then you have to convolve that with the JWST PSF. And for an extended source, that actually changes how bright and where the brightness is of the emission from the disk. So you almost have to deconvolve the influence of the PSF to really understand the morphology of the disk you're looking at. And then thanks both to everyone who's already talked about CGI, so I don't really have to spend time explaining what that is. But with CGI, you have a very highly optimized coronagraph with a transmissive LEO mask in the imaging plane. And so if you have a disk that's hiding under the mask, just as we saw in one of the posters where someone had gone much closer and had a much smaller inner working angle with JWST's transmissive LEO masks, you're going to get some emission from something interior to that mask that gets spread out into the outside. So if you have a disk that's just under your mask, you may see some evidence of it at larger separations, or it may cause noise for your planet detections. And that noise can change depending on the inclination of that disk. So that becomes important when we're thinking about exozodies for CGI, because not all the exozodies are going to be outside of the inner working angle. Or for HWO, where you might have hot dust inside the inner working angle that might be causing excess noise. And in fact, I hope someone will also show that this is already an issue for JWST. A lot of protoplanetary disks have a lot of emission at their inner, at very close to the star, and that leaks out of a lot of the JWST coronagraphic spots too. So I mentioned forces and the little sailboats in space. So here are some examples of how those forces come into play. So on the left, I have the debris disk AUMIC. It's a beautiful edge-on disk, very close to the Earth, 10 parsecs away. It has these sort of bumps and wiggles on one side of the disk. And if you look at snapshots of the disk over time, you'll see that these bumps and wiggles kind of change position and move in radial directions. Super weird. But we think what's happening, right, is that this is an M dwarf. It has a lot of flares. It has a lot of coronal mass ejections. So we think what's happening, presumably, although we could be wrong, because I'm not doing any of this, is that that's blowing material out and entraining some of the dust in those ejections and pushing it out in a radial direction. And then I mentioned, again, HD 61005 has this bowl shape. And what we think is going on here, and stuff that I've done in the sort of looked at this in the past, is that perhaps the dust is being blown out due to interactions with the interstellar medium. So those are two pressure forces. But you can have gravity interactions with planets as well that also kick dust out outside of the disk. And so these are some models by Li and Chang that demonstrated that if you have a disk that's being perturbed by a planet, and so there's a lot of material that's sort of being sent out on eccentric orbits, depending on the inclination and rotation of that disk relative to our line of sight, you can get a lot of asymmetries and shapes that mimic things like ISM interaction and stuff like that. So gravitational interactions with planets can also be a way of pushing dust grains in different directions. And I should say, throughout the talk, I should go back. Nope, there we go. Throughout the talk, I'm trying to put posters that deal with some of these issues. So I apologize that I didn't call this out earlier. But if you look online, hopefully you'll see these as well. So I encourage you to go to these posters if you want to learn more details about how planets interact with debris disks, or about white dwarf planets, or any of the other things where I sort of call different posters out. So let's talk about the future in my last 9 minutes. I'm running a little fast, so this is good. More time for questions and discussion. So we talk about CGI on the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, and as other people have said, this is primarily a technology demonstration, but if things go well, there will be a lot of time for really interesting science. And I was just here 2 weeks ago explaining how there were sort of 3 possibilities. Even if we just meet the baseline requirements for CGI, there's going to be some really cool science that we can do on a small number of targets. And if things go really well, we can do transformative science on a moderate to large number of targets. And that may spur an extended mission for the CGI. So in the best case scenario, if everything's working really well and CGI gets approved for sort of extended observations, we can do transformative debris disk science in particular, and probably some really great planet direct imaging as well. But this is just a schematic of what I would consider a highly optimized coronagraph in space. So it's exactly the opposite of the STS coronagraph. And what makes it so optimized, among other things, is you have sort of very modern masks and occulters that really try to reject a lot of light even before you try to correct all the aberrations in the system. And then you have something that's called LOFUS, and that basically takes care of the jitter and the focus changes and all the low order aberrations that can be caused in a system. And after that gets corrected and things go through a couple different things, you also have high order wavefront sensing and control. And this is through deformable mirrors. So it's almost like an extreme adaptive optics system in space, which is pretty cool. And the combination of those things provide very, very high contrast imaging. And in addition, you have the ability to do imaging, spectroscopy, and polarization. So if you remember, I said polarization was really, really important for understanding dust composition, grain size, and grain shape. And so CGI has the capability to do that already, would have the capability to do that for disks we already know about, and potentially for exozodies as well. And so there's an example of like measuring the polarization fraction in the visible for HR 4796A. I mentioned that ACS had this capability, but only 2 or 3 stars were observed with polarimetry that have debris disks. So this is a really wide open field that I am really hopeful that CGI will fill in really interesting ways. In addition, we will have the ability to look for exozodies either directly or indirectly by looking at a lot of nearby stars that are probably good targets for a habitable worlds observer. And what's shown here is, as a function of inner working angle, the cumulative number of stars, habitable zones that are accessible. So the inner working angle of the hybrid Leo coronagraph on CGI is about 0.15 arc seconds. And so of order 70 stars have some portion of their habitable zone accessible, which is useful. And then maybe a dozen actually have what is called the Earth equivalent insolation distance, right? So our own Earth at 1 AU gets a certain amount of radiation from our 1 solar luminosity star. But if you have a 5 luminosity star, you get that same amount of radiation a little bit further out. And if you're an M star, you get that much closer to the star. So that's what we mean by an Earth equivalent insolation distance. And so about 12 stars, nearby stars, will actually be able to directly probe the habitable zone for Earth-like analogs. So that's not bad. That's if we devote 400-ish or more hours to doing a search of all these targets. And this would be in the situation where CGI is working really well and there's been sort of an extended mission approved. And why is that important? Well, I mentioned that our tiny little planets that are micron size that both scatter light and emit thermally, we actually don't know how that works too well, right? Because we don't really understand the typical composition of a debris disk. We don't really understand the typical grain sizes or the shapes. We have some models, they don't always work. And in particular, if we see some infrared emission, like with the host survey, we don't have a good way of predicting what the scattered light from that dust will look like. And that's really, really important for something like the Habitable Worlds Observer. Because if dust scatters more efficiently than we think in our own, than we sort of see in our own solar system, we could be kind of screwed. And if it scatters light less efficiently, then we're in a really good situation. And all of our yield calculations that you guys will be working on hands-on in a couple days will change a little bit. So what I'm showing here, see if I can go back since I talked. So what I'm showing here is a 10 to the minus ninth companion at about 2.5 AU. And then there's a 5 Zodi disk at about 3 AU. That is, what I mean by here, Zodi, is 5 times the visible brightness, the surface brightness of our own Zodi. So that's different than 5 thermal infrared Zodis. So just keep that in mind. If someone's in the infrared community talking about Zodis, they mean a different thing potentially than someone talking about Zodis in scattered light. And that connection is not well known theoretically. So our ability to predict scattered light for Zodis is at this time uncertain. And now if we add a PSF, like for CGI, you barely see the planet, and the confusion with your Zodi becomes more pronounced. So this is what we want to avoid, right? We want to avoid looking at a lot of stars. If we want planets, we want to avoid looking at a lot of these stars for planets that have a lot of dust. Now, we may want to look at them to just study the dust, but that's sort of a different story. And I mentioned hot dust. So I'm going to take my last 3 minutes to talk about hot dust. And this is really important for direct imaging with HWO. And I'll give you a semi-scary example, which may or may not be typical. But I mentioned Kappa Tucanae, right? It had an infrared excess observed in the H band and the L band. And it was inferred to be hot dust at about 0.3 AU. Okay? But the range of possible minimum grain sizes for that dust based on the thermal emission was anywhere from 10 to the minus 3 micron to like 0.6 micron. So that's a wide range. And then if you do a simple radiative transfer calculation of what kind of integrated scattered light you might expect, you get this curve. So this is scattered flux over the flux of the star as a function of wavelength. And you can see the submicron dust, which is unsurprisingly really efficient at scattering light at submicron wavelengths, can be almost as much as 1% the total emission of the star. That's a lot. Recall that if you want to see a planet, you're at 10 to the minus 9. Okay, but that uncertainty is orders of magnitude. It could be anywhere in this regime. And then if you do some quick calculations, if you wanted to look at Kappa Tuc with HWO, this dust that's emitting possibly at 1%, the fraction of the star, is sitting right at lambda over d for HWO. That is not a good place to be for a LEO coronagraph, because that's exactly where you want to be rejecting light. Most coronagraphs are really sensitive to how much resolved emission there is, and having that much resolved emission at lambda over d could be problematic. So a little scary. So this figure is going to appear in an upcoming report from NASA that I'm co-leading on the impact of exozodi dust and hot dust on direct imaging. So keep an eye out for that when it comes out. And how bad could it be? Well, about 20% of stars seem to show some evidence of hot dust around them. So this could be a non-trivial issue. And so we need to devote some time to really understanding what hot dust is and what its scattered light might look like, because this is going to be an issue for Habitable Worlds Observer. Okay. So, I'm in the red. That means I better shut up soon. So debris disks are the remnants of planet formation. They're really good at tracing planetary architectures, and they're really good at obscuring planets sometimes, except when they reveal the location of planets sometimes. So it could be, a mixed bag. And they really show us the planetary system on a wide scale, all the way from the rocky bodies in the system to the icy bodies at far distances. Their location, composition, and behavior under various forces tell us about the dust's origins, and the evolution of this debris disk over time. And they're both trash, treasure, and unexpected surprise. And so they're fun to study, and sometimes they're really annoying. So you got to learn about them to know what to do. Thank you. And I highly encourage questions because there's no stupid questions.
Yes. Okay, we definitely have time for a couple questions. In the back, I'm going to come with the microphone. It'll take a moment or so.
Thank you for the presentation, sir. I wonder how accurately can we estimate mass of the debris disk planetesimal's total mass versus the mass in exoplanetary systems versus the mass of exoplanets? Is the disk mass bigger or smaller than mass of planets in the planetary system, or like the order of magnitude of accuracy?
So that is a tricky question. It's a great question. On average, we think that dust disks are less massive than terrestrial planets. So moon masses are typically a typical debris disk's mass. But this is hard to do because your disk mass is dependent on your largest grain size, which you typically don't have access to, except for you basically are sensitive to the grain size at the wavelength of light you're looking at. So if you're looking the submillimeter, you can get a fairly decent measure of the amount of mass and dust up till that grain size. But this is assumed to be sort of like a continuum up to sort of like rocky asteroid sizes. So we don't really know the total mass locked up in both the parent bodies and the dust sometimes.
Okay, so I think we have a question over here.
Hi, John. Thanks for the talk. So you talked about how Roman CGI will be really important for helping us understand this potential exozodi issue, but that's going to be launching in a few years. And so my question is there anything we can do now or up until then to help us investigate this further?
Yeah, so I think taking a look at, for example, interferometry has some access to exozodies, and so I would advocate for doing more of that. Using STS to do more visible light scattered investigations can help us potentially by pushing to lower luminosity disks and trying to get into that transport dominated regime to see if that can help us to understand dust composition and grain size in sort of those regimes. And there's many more things. But those are the big ones that I can think of right now.
Okay, we still have time for a couple more questions. I think we have a question on the other side of the room.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I had a question about the slide where you showed these different structural features in the debris disk and talked about how they are formed under different kinds of forces. So for protoplanetary disks, I know we try to do radiative transfer modeling to understand these structures, but there is no real certainty given how young these disks are and how hard it is to find something as solid as a planet hiding in it. But debris disks are far more evolved. And so is there more certainty with the debris disk to say what sort of forces give those kind of structures?
Right. So several people have worked on this and have made some predictions for if you see sort of a slope to the inner edge of your disk, that perhaps that tells you something about the mass of the planet. I think there's a poster by Stuber that talks a little bit about this too. And so there are many predictions, but from what I've seen so far, there have been not a lot of connections to actual planet and disk situations. And that's primarily because a lot of the planets we've detected that have debris disks, the debris disk hasn't been well spatially resolved. So we really need a situation, I think, where we have a sample of planets and disks. They're both pretty well characterized in terms of mass of planet and parameters of disk, and that'll really calibrate a lot of the predictions that people are making. So there are predictions, I just don't know how accurate they are yet. There's still uncertainty.
All right, cool. We have time for maybe one more quick question. Okay, how about Ray?
Thanks for a nice talk. And I'm find it is very interesting that we can see flare-like features around a unique by direct imaging. So I'm wondering that is it possible to combine image and astroseismic signal from spectra to give a better constraint on stellar activity?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is there's not yet a strong connection between what kind of flare or coronal mass ejection might be causing the structures we see. And so I think the best avenue for studying the stellar activity is to really just look at the star with like TESS or Kepler or some of those things to understand the behavior that way. And then you use that to explain what we see in the structures. So I think at this point, that's probably the most fruitful avenue of investigation.
Awesome. Okay, so we should end this here. Let's